guys, and welcome back to Mother's Mystery Podcast. It's your host, Cece, here with
Colleen, the co-host.
Yeah, we're coming back to you guys. It is 4th of July weekend. We're recording this on the 6th, so 4th of July has passed, but I hope you guys had a safe and wonderful weekend. For our American friends, if we have non-American friends, you have no idea what we're talking about. Us heathens like to celebrate with explosions and alcohol. So, yeah, anyway, we had a fun 4th of July. We had a safe 4th of July this year. Yeah, it was nice.
It was. Got to go over to Courtney's for a cookout, and then we went to the park with the grandkids, all my grandsons, all 5 of them.
Yep.
And watched the fireworks.
It was nice.
It was. Nice park.
Yeah, where we live has a very, very beautiful park. It's very well upkept. And yeah, it's a really nice park. I don't live in a big city. I live in it's called a village.
Suburb.
It's a suburb of a bigger city pretty much, because in 10 minutes you can be inside the city. But yeah, so we have a nice little village park. It's very beautiful. I fully admit that. Hold on. All right, guys. So, this week, okay, I don't want to downplay it. I didn't do a whole lot of research, only because I have followed this particular subject, I guess, for a while. So I wrote a lot of this from my own memory. This week and possibly next week, we'll see how recording goes. It's going to get really personal, guys. I have personal feelings on this. I know Colleen probably has personal feelings on this. I have followed this group for a very, very long time before I even had the inkling to do a podcast. So, this one, I have a disclaimer to read here in a little bit. I also have a warning to put on this episode and possibly next week's episode. Like I said, we have to see how recording goes. But, so our warning labels, I'm going to tell them to you guys now. This is a cult, and I will get into why I'm going to say it's a cult, and people will probably disagree with me, which is perfectly fine. Everyone has a right to their opinion, and I do not hate on anybody for their opinions. I have my own opinions. Everyone's allowed to, but as my opinion, and I am not a cult expert who does a lot with survivors from cult situations, and he has a breakdown that I'm going to read you guys about why this group meets criteria to be called a cult. All right. On the heels of that, guys, we ran into some technical difficulty, and I basically had to scrap the remainder of this episode. So this is a post-recording. This is coming to you after the fact. And I've had a little bit of time to think and gather my thoughts a little bit on this, so going to throw it out there. This is going to be a two-parter. So sorry, you guys got to hang in there to hear the rest of it, but this is going to be a two-parter. I also am going to scrap the disclaimer, the professional disclaimer, I'll put it that way, because now that I've had a little bit of time to think on it and reflect on how I want to present this, I want to preference this episode and the following episode by saying this group, we're going to talk about the FLDS, specifically Warren Jeffs and his crimes, because that's the crime aspect of it. But I want to preference that by saying this group is considered a cult because of its leader. Not all groups, religious, culty, communities are evil. And I want to make that very clear for you all. We have our opinions. We can look at a group from the outside and see what happens and call it evil. But we have to remember that the crimes of one person do not reflect on every human being that is a part of a group. With that being said, I am not going to downplay the awful atrocities that happened within this group. The crimes that Warren Jeffs committed under the guise of religious exemption and religious expression are disgusting. And just because he is a despicable human being does not reflect on the entire community. Because when you get to the core of it, he was one evil man that was given power and abused his power. So, not everybody in this group is guilty of these crimes. Not everybody who follows this sect is an evil human being. There are still humans that follow this religion and truly believe in it. And that is their prerogative. And they're allowed to do that. And after thinking about it, I also listened to another podcast that was talking to some people that are still a part of this community. It made me reflect a little bit to realize that speaking on this group from the outside is only one aspect of it, because there are people who live it and who truly believe in it, and that doesn't make them bad people. It doesn't mean that they enforce what their leader did. It doesn't exempt them from what their leader did either, because there were plenty of people who knew and turned a blind eye to it, and they're just as guilty. But there are good people. And at the base of this group is a love for family and community. And I want us to be respectful and remember that groups like these are molded after a perfect mold, after everything works correctly and what it's supposed to be like in a perfect setting. And we have to realize that we are humans and we are not perfect and things don't go perfectly. So what this group believes in sounds great at surface level, but then you have to dig in and remember that people abuse power and they abuse their rank and they do horrible things with that. So with that being said, I just want us to remember that, yes, this one person's crimes are horrible and unforgivable, and they deserve the punishment that they got, if not a worse punishment, because let's be honest, sometimes prison isn't always the best punishment for people. Sometimes they deserve worse. But I want us to remember that this one person does not embody the entire community. So I want us to look at, to remember that that there are people who still live this life and that they still deserve respect and love and grace because they truly believe this, and it doesn't make them a bad person for believing this. But it doesn't excuse the crimes and the abuse that happened because of it. Okay? So, with that being said, this is going to be a two-parter, guys. This first half that I am re-recording now, I'm going to give you some history and some backstory and kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about next week, which is truly going to be the crime and the Warren Jeffs FLDS era, which sadly, even though the man is behind bars and has been convicted, is still going on. His reign doesn't end because he's locked up, and that's another sad reality that we can discuss too. But I just wanted us to remember that we're humans and that there are humans that believe in this and that they deserve a little bit of grace and respect, because these people aren't monsters. What they choose to believe in doesn't make them a monster. Now, if you chose to blindly believe in the man and not the religion, then, that's another thing. But hearing stories of some of these people, I realized that they're beautiful humans who believe in something so strongly. And it doesn't make them bad because they believe in it. It's just a horrible situation with one man who abused power. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to say, guys. This episode is not going to be so much of the abuse. I'm not going to put any warning labels on this one because we're just going to do some history stuff, some background, and lead up to the Warren Jeffs era of the FLDS. So, yeah, let's get into it, guys. All right, guys. Like I said, we are going to talk about the FLDS, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's a Mormon fundamentalist group whose members practice polygamy. This sect of Mormonism happened because of a break that happened in the 1800s. I'm sorry, not the 1800s. The 1904 is when the real break happened. But this is a Mormon fundamentalist group. So they believe in the Book of Mormon by Joseph Smith. I'm just going to read you a little blippet of history, okay? The Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, FLDS Church, traces its claims to spiritual authority to when Brigham Young, the then president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, once visited the Short Creek community, which the Short Creek community, you guys, is on the border of Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona, which that comes to play later on. But at this time, it was the Arizona territory, and this was a creek valley. It was very fertile, very isolated. It still is pretty well isolated today. But anyway, back to that. When Brigham Young visited Short Creek community, he said, "This will someday be the head and not the tail of the church. This will be the Valley of Saints. This land will produce abundance, an abundance sufficient of wheat to feed the people." So that's a Brigham Young quote talking about the Short Creek community. So the break that prompted the FLDS was the 1904 LDS Church issued the Second Manifesto renouncing polygamy and eventually excommunicating Mormons who continued to solidify and enter into new plural marriages. The Mormons had always been prosecuted. That's what led them west. They left because they were searching for lands where they could freely practice this religion. So from the time in Nauvoo, Illinois, because we're from the Midwest, so we know Nauvoo, that's where Joseph Smith died. Brigham Young takes over, and he moves everybody west, trying to find new land to practice this religion. They really end up putting a settlement in the Salt Valley, which is now Salt Lake City. It booms. They have great agriculture because they do so well. Brigham Young sends word back to bring more Mormons. So more people travel westward. This is kind of the wagon trail, the Oregon Trail kind of situation. I mean, people went further, but a lot of the Mormons were part of that pioneer era where they traveled west, and this pioneer trail led through the Salt Lake Valley. So they're pioneers, and they're moving west. And Brigham Young is bringing more Mormons out, telling them that, this is the land. We're kind of free to do what we want out here. Come. So the Utah was pretty well colonized by Mormons. So that's why you have a big saturation of LDS in this area. So Brigham Young calls more Mormons out there. They settle it. Short Creek, located at what was then the Arizona Territory, soon became the gathering place for these Mormons. Members of these communities believed in a statement published in 1912 by Lawrence C. Woolley. He's another prominent prophet of the 1886 divine revelation of the LDS Church President John Taylor at the time, took precedence over the 1890 manifesto, which had prohibited new plural marriage by any LDS member. The community believed that the 1890 manifesto, Wilford Woodruff sold his rights to the priesthood, thereby making Lauren's father, John W. Woolley, his successor in the one-man domain. We're going to dig more into the one-man rule situation here, but that's just, you needed to hear that. After being excommunicated from the LDS Church, some of the local prominent men in Short Creek, including Lauren Woolley and John Y. Barlow, created the organization known as the Council of Friends. The Council of Friends consisted of 7 high priests that were said to be the governing priesthood body on earth. Was the governing body over Short Creek community until being incorporated the FDL Church under Rulon Jeffs. He is the leader before Mr. Warren Jeffs. He was his father. Again, I'm going to break that down. We're going to talk more about that. So, anybody who did not renounce the plural marriage was excommunicated from the LDS Church. So that's kind of what formed this fundamentalist group. I'm not going to call it a church yet because in this timeline, I'm trying to stay kind of linear. They are not the FLDS Church yet. They are just fundamentalist Mormons. So Short Creek kind of booms into being the polygamist refuge. Like I said, it was isolated, so they could kind of go and freely practice this part of their religion. So that's the Short Creek community. That's kind of the rising of the fundamentalist Mormons and where they stand. There are other groups. There is the Apostolized Unit Brethren. The AUB is another group. It's still in this area. They're still fundamentalist. Kingston group. They are more Canadian based, but it's a polygamous group that they still feed into this sect. There's a lot of little break-off groups because obviously they have there's a lot of issues with succession and who's the prophet on earth for them. So they have some break-off groups that come later on. I'm not going to get into them because for this case's sake, they're not super important. But if you guys want to do your own research, more than free to dig into that. I might dig into some of that later on, but for all intents and purposes, we are going to focus on the Warren Jeffs era. So I've kind of laid down how they moved out there and stuff like that. I am not 100% clear on their beliefs, so I personally don't want to break down what they believe in other than they believe in plural marriage, that for a man to go to heaven, the highest heaven, celestial heaven, he has to have at least 3 wives. That is a pretty core belief for them, which is why they want to live plurally. I don't want to tell you guys wrongly, so I'm not going to break down any more of their religion. You guys can look up Book of Mormon, drafts about that and dig into that and get some more understanding. But we're just gonna, for all intents and purposes, the plural marriage is what we're focusing on in that aspect right now. So going along with the history, I'm going to talk now about something that I know solidifies their beliefs because it happened, and it kind of helps us lead into why this group is so secretive and so closed off from the rest of the world. And playing back on my please have a sympathetic mind for this, personally, I read this and I have an understanding about this and I sympathize with these people because I could only imagine you're good people, you're living your lives, you're not causing problems at this time, and this happens to you. And I understand why you would close down. Any rational person understands why you would close off and fold into yourselves. So I'm going to read about this Short Creek raid that happened. And this is just a small blippet. I can go into more detail about this, but this is just a small little blippet about what happened. So anyway, this is a Short Creek raid. In the morning of July 26, 1953, 102 Arizona State Police officers and National Guard soldiers raided the fundamentalist Mormon community of Short Creek, Arizona. This is before they broke off. Like I said, this is Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. This alleyway right there. They're two cities, but they're meshed together now. But this was still Short Creek at the time. They arrested the entire population, including 236 children. Of those 236 children, 150 were never allowed to return to their parents, and for more than 2 years. Other parents would never regain custody of their children. The Short Creek raid was the largest mass arrest of polygamists in American history, and it received a great deal of press coverage. After the raid, polygamists continued to live there, and later the town was renamed Colorado City. That is a very short, skimmed over blippet of this raid. So to bring it back, I believe 36 men were arrested. 236 children were seized at the time. I can't remember the number of women. Hold on, maybe I can pull it up. But they were all separated. And the men were all arrested, and some of them were released. Others were convicted of polygamy. Yeah, see, I'm not seeing a number of how many women they removed from the settlement. But anyway, I digress. Let's keep going. So families were separated. And a lot of children were completely separated and never reunited with their families again. In my vast research, I heard an interview with a lady who she's recounting her mother was part of this raid. And she's recounting that her mother was very heavily pregnant at the time and was on a rickety bus to Phoenix, Arizona, and went into early labor. So, they take her to a hospital, and she gives birth, and the hospital takes the baby. She's not allowed to see the baby, and they keep her away from the baby for a very, very long time, and then they have to reunite because baby's obviously hungry, and she has to feed her. And the nurses is like, well, we didn't want to let you feed her because we didn't want you to get attached because we're trying to find a home for her. So they're trying to take her newborn child away, and they were going to try to adopt her out to a non-polygamous family, pretty much. I tell you that story to tell you the mindset of why they did this raid. It wasn't because these men were malicious and breaking any... I mean, I guess they were breaking laws because polygamy was illegal, but they're not hurting anybody. They just want to live their religion in their community. And the government came in and were like, no, yank, we're taking your wives, we're taking your kids. So I understand why this community chose to shut ranks, because if you're living your life and somebody just comes in and they're like, I don't like what you're doing, so I'm taking your husband, your significant other, I'm taking your kids away. Like, I completely understand, because these are non-violent people. If I didn't preference that before, this is a non-violent, like the Mormons, they don't believe in military service and stuff like that. So this is a non-violent community. That's not to say that there isn't violence within it, but this very practicing religion, they're non-violent. So this is a peaceful, non-violent community living their lives, and the government just came in and decided to yank children away. This will not be the first time that the government comes in and raids this community. For good reason, obviously, later on when we find out what happens. But Their secretism and their choice to close out the mainstream world, I see the reasoning behind it. Do I think it's right? That's my opinion. And no, but I understand why you did it. So that being said, that is a huge cornerstone of this. They teach this a lot. This is, still to this day, do they teach about this raid? All right, so I could go through a whole list of the priesthood heads and everything, but I am going to talk about the Leroy S. Johnson era, the Rulon Jeff era that leads into the Warren Jeffs era, because there are stark contrasts between each era of these prophets. So from the stuff that I've heard and read, the Leroy S. Johnson era, they call him Uncle Leroy. Very peaceful. This was after the raid. They're rebuilding their community and their lives. Everything was peaceful. This is also when one-man rule comes back. So they had the Council of Friends that was usually a council, but Uncle Leroy chooses to dismiss the council. And he chooses to do the one-man rule doctrine, which is saying that there is one man on earth who is the mouthpiece of God, and they are to rule alone. So that is their belief. So he chooses to dismiss the council, and Uncle Leroy leads this group alone. That's not to say he doesn't have bishops that help, or he doesn't have people that he counsels with, but he alone is to make the decisions, to put it that way. Leroy is very good friends with Rulon Jeffs, and they confide in each other. So when Leroy Johnston passes away, Rulon Jeffs takes over as the prophet. And that's because they had a strong friendship, and I think that they learned and leaned on each other. So that was I'm sure there was, excuse me, I'm sure there was tension within the group because there were probably other people that they thought should be the leader, but Leroy Johnson chose to appoint Rulon Jeffs as the leader when he passed away. So the Uncle Leroy era was supposed to be a very peaceful one. Interviews that I've heard, everybody talks about going to Cottonwood Park, which is kind of in the middle of these two cities. It's a big park that they share, and having watermelon for his birthday. A lot of people say that he was like the people's prophet. He didn't live above them. And that's huge to know when we start talking about Rulon, that he had a modest house. He had quite a few wives, but nothing exorbitant, I guess. So it was just a peaceful time, community driven. This community is known for their music. They like to do little skits and plays and stuff. So it was just, this group is really community and family based. And I want to stress that, guys, so that you can see the humanity in this group, because yes, you might have 3+ wives and you might have 20 some children, but you have that big family unit that you love, and you coincide and you cohabitate together, but you also have a focus on community. So if your neighbor is lacking, you help them. With that being said, they have a whole group that they enact called the All right, so it is the UEP, the United Effort Plan, also known as the UEP Trust, is a charitable organization which was originally formed in 1942, a subsidized organization of the FLD Church. The organization was based in the Short Creek community, conspiring of Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona, which was the primary base for the FLDS Church. The UEP was created by John Y. Barlow and the church's view with the United Order, meaning to live a traditional Latter-day Saints doctrine of the law of consecration. This involves that you don't own your land. You consecrate your land to the church or the UEP, and then they divvy it out. It is kind of like it's a communist-based mindset, if you will, because everybody's equal and everybody shares. So the UEP was created as a land trust. They purchased all this land around Short Creek, Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. If you were a member of the church, you would go and you would say, I want land, I want to build a house. And I am assuming that there was some kind of meeting about it, and they would say, okay, we're going to give you this land and you're going to build on it, but you do not own this property. We are leasing it to you to live on, but you do not own this property. It belongs to the church. This was created, I mean, it was started in 42, but they really doubled down on this after the government raid because the government seized land and property away from these people. They doubled down on this after the 53 Short Creek raid, and they really enforced this because they didn't want the government or anybody to take anything away from them again. Again, as a human being, looking at it from the outside, I understand completely. If you had gone through something like that, where they taken everything away from you, your families, your land and stuff like that, I understand why and this sounds, in a perfect world, great. Everybody gets the same amount of land. Everybody gets the same opportunity. You guys share resources. You help each other build houses. That sounds great, but humans are corrupt again. So that's the problem we're going to run into, is that this sounds great, and if it's run perfectly, awesome, but there are greedy humans that abuse this system. This becomes a huge issue in the Warren Jeffs era, and again, we're going to talk about this in the next episode, and I will dig deeper into the UEP and the controversy that happens with it. But I'm just telling you that now so that we kind of get a feel of, the Short Creek climate, and it's communal. You have your families, but you commune together as a community. So they're living their religion, they're living their communities, they're building their families, living their lives. And this is a really skated version, guys. So the Leroy Jeffs UEP era, the Leroy Johnston UEP era is good. People are building houses, they're living communally. Part of the Mormon religion is end of days. They're an end of days religion. So they're stockpiling resources. They believe in that God's going to return and they're going to be the righteous ones, and he's going to lift up their community and save them from the destruction. So they have to have food and supplies to restart humanity. That's a huge pillar of their religion too. So they communally stockpile supplies, they build together, they commune together, they share everything because that's what they believe. I mean, in the end of times, you believe that you're the only righteous people, so you all have to stick together with the same beliefs. So at the core of it, this is a communal religion, cult. So they're living communally. Like I said, the Leroy Johnston era was relaxed. They also believe that women and men dress modestly. So if you guys know anything about the FLDS, they wear those prairie dresses. But before their dress got really strict, they were just very modestly dressed. Men wore button-down shirts, collars, long sleeves. Women wore long dresses. Later on, during the Rulin, Warren Jeffs eras, that strictens up quite a bit. But that's another, they believe in modest dress, so, you keep your body covered and stuff like that. So, Leroy Johnston passes away. Rulon Jeffs takes hold. Is the prophet now. Rulon is not from the Short Creek community. He is from Salt Lake City, which there's a community of polygamists up there as well, along with the LDS church. So there's a divide that happens, but not as a break off. It's just people went from Uncle Leroy, who was the people's prophet. He was there with them. He was living with them. He was communing with them. He was one of them. And then they get Rulon, who had an accounting firm, lived in Salt Lake City, had a Learjet, had a big house, fancy cars. And people of Short Creek, this is a modest community. You know, there's very smart individuals that come from this and stuff like that, but this is a modest community. So there's the divide there because Rulon seems bigger than Uncle Leroy did. So the Rulon era, is still peaceful. During the John Barlow era, they do something, because before this you could court and you could marry who you wanted. You're sealed in the temple to your partners, but you could kind of court and pick who you wanted to marry. Barlow enacted that the prophet would pick your partner for you, and Leroy really leaned into this too, where if you're a father and you've got 3 daughters who are all coming of age, and we're just gonna say 18. They're coming of age at 18. You would take them to a meeting to the prophet, and you would say, "Prophet, Uncle Leroy, these are my 3 daughters. I'm turning them over to you. They're ready to marry. So when God tells you who their husband is, they are ready." And Uncle Leroy would be like, "All right, I shall pray on it and I will listen for the word of God." And it could be the next day, the next month, the next year. But in their belief, God comes down and whispers in the prophet's ear who the woman needs to marry or who the man needs to marry. And your prophet will tell you and you would do it. This becomes more prevalent with Rulon's time, that fathers turn over their daughters and sons, because of course you're going to come and be like, "Okay, my son's ready to marry." And the prophet will tell you who to marry. He places you in a marriage. You don't get to pick, kind of situation. So this becomes an issue because past, it would be a respectable age. 17, 18, 19, you would turn your daughters over and they would marry. Now, granted, there were still marriages that would happen between like an 18-year-old girl marrying an older man. That happens. But they're 18. I'm not saying you're full-grown adults at 18, because I can tell you right now, I was 18 and I was not a full-grown adult. I'm in my 30s now and I don't feel like I'm a full-grown adult sometimes. But that's a more adult decision. During Rulon's reign, it becomes more fogged because fathers, in this community, women are a commodity, which I don't want to put that in your minds, but it has to be said. If you're a father who has many daughters, it's like a currency, because you can turn them over and they can marry up and they can marry higher ranks in the church, and then you have a little bit of pull. That's just how it is. It's a patriarchal society, whether we want to admit it or not. So the men rule everything and women are a commodity, almost like a possession. And that's the sad reality of it. So the Rulon Jeffs era, the lines blur a little bit, where fathers would turn over younger and younger daughters. And sometimes it wouldn't even be that they would turn them over. Sometimes it would be greedy, evil older men preying on young women. And that's where we start blurring the lines between a religious community and predatorialism. Because you're older men with power and you are fifth, sixth, seventh generation FLDS and you know no better. And you are a 16-year-old girl and your father decides to turn you over to the church, and a 50-year-old man with 3 other wives comes up and says, I want her. And sometimes it would happen. It wouldn't be a divine revelation from God. It would just be, oh, you're my friend and you want that woman to marry, you want her to be your 4th wife. Okay, let's make it happen. If you're going to give a little bit more money to the church, if you're going to I'll scratch your back, and later on you're going to have to scratch mine. And that's where we start to get the breakdown where humans aren't perfect, and what this beautiful community could have been starts to break down because we're greedy humans. And that's where we start to get into problems, and that problematicness bleeds really heavy into the Warren Jeffs era. But I digress. We're not at the Warren Jeffs era yet. We're still talking. Rulin is the prophet of the FLDS from the years of 1986 to 2002. I have to tell you guys that Rulin, this is an end of day culture. So they believe that they're preparing for the end of days and they're going to be the righteous ones. Rulin prophesizes that he is the last prophet. He is going to bring the people into the millennium. They had many prophecies that said that the world was going to end in 2000, which a lot of groups did, for those of you who are old enough to remember the millennium. So this group was no different. They prophesied that the world was going to end in the year 2000. Rulin Jeffs was going to be their last prophet, and he was going to usher them into what they call Zion, which is their heaven, which is their golden era, which is where the wicked are all erased from earth and only the righteous prosper. So with the one-man rule, Rulin has no successor. So, and he's prophesizing that he is going to live for 300 years and carry these people into their new millennium. But sadly, Rulin does not he carries them into the millennium, but he does not live 300 years. He has a series of strokes, becomes very weak and feeble, and ends up passing away in 2002. With the succession being so blurred because of the one-man rule, the community's lost because Rulin was supposed to live forever. He had, 60 some odd wives, some of them being as young as 14 in the end. And I'm going to elaborate on that here in a minute. So just hold on to that thought. And he's preaching that he's going to take them into the millennium and that he's never going to die, and God is going to renew him and he's going to be young and vile and vigorous, and he passes away. So the community is very lost and confused. And this is when his son, who he brought in as he got ill to help bridge things, but I wholeheartedly believe Warren Jeffs is an evil human being, and he took the opportunity to help his father. He seized that into pushing for power, solidifying his power so that he could do evil things. So, I have no doubt that he had planned something for a very long time, but when Rulin had his first stroke and got weak and kind of pushed him to that secondhand status, that the wheel started turning and Warren Jeffs' plan got fast-tracked. I don't think this just happened with the presence of power. I think he is a truly wicked and disturbed man, and that this was just his golden ticket to enact all of his evilness. Rulon had given Warren power before, just not priesthood power. Warren Jeffs was the principal of the FLDS run school, Alta Academy. I'm not going to dig into that again in this episode because the next episode is when we're going to dig into Warren and his evil. I'm just laying foundation right now, guys. But Warren was slowly taking power, and when Rulon got sick and Warren came in to help him, he was taking more and more power. And to do that, he started to isolate the community from Rulon. So when Rulon was sick, and strokes are horrific, but you can bounce back from them. But Warren was isolating Rulon from the community, and he was using it as a bargaining chip. So if you questioned him or questioned anything that Rulon said that he was enacting, you were ripped away from your communication with Rulon. So he was isolating Rulon away from the community and solidifying his power. And he was taking more and more liberties. And as Rulon got sicker, he was enacting prophecies and rules and things and saying, oh, well, my father said this, so I am just acting for my father. And when Rulon was very, very sick and very, very feeble, he was like, well, my father had these prophecies and I am just acting on what my father said, and he is still speaking to God and he is having all these visions, and it's from the mind of Warren Jeffs. I also want to talk about the fact that in the last 6 years of Rulon's life, I'm going to say 4. In the last 4 years of Rulon's life, when he was very, very sick, Warren was doing marriages of younger and younger women to his father. And it was not wholly my belief, but I think he was picking partners, marrying them to his father so that he could have him when his father passed away. Because you have an 84-year-old man marrying a 19-year-old girl. Not uncommon in this religious sect. But then your father passes away and you start to marry your father's wives. It's odd. And it's a power play. But I say that to kind of prove a point that he was calculated from the beginning. I also have to tell you that Warren Jeffs, when he was born 3 months premature, and while he was in the hospital, his mother said some of the prophets from the church came to her and they kind of prophesied over Warren, and they said he's going to live and he's going to do great things. So Warren Jeffs grew up with this mindset that he was going to do great things. And I think his mother, and I think Rulon too, always made that prevalent in his life, that like this prophecy was put upon you when you were a teeny tiny baby, you're going to do great things. I think that was mentally ingrained in his brain, and that's what gave him this God complex to do these horrific things. I'm trying really hard not to dig into this, but I'm getting to a point in time where like it's coming. So anyway, with that being said, I have called this group a cult, and I should give you some reasoning why I did that, because I don't throw around the cult word without good reasoning. So if you know anything about the culty world, and if you have done any research on other cults and groups like this, there is a man called Rick Ross, not the rapper Rick Ross. He is a psychologist that does deprogramming stuff with people from cult situations. And he is kind of, if you're in this community and if you follow this stuff, he is kind of like the tell-all on cult expertise. So I call this group a cult because he himself has done a breakdown of like the things that solidify a group as being cult behavior. He's written lots of books. I've seen many, many interviews with this man. He's an expert, and I follow him exclusively, and he did a whole thing about the FLDS and why it's a cult, and I'm going to share with you the criteria that he says makes a group a cult, so that when we start to talk about Warren Jeffs, that you can kind of see that this cult mentality comes out. It might have been a cult mentality beforehand, but it is solidified in the Warren Jeffs era. With that being said, Rick Ross, his outline for cult behavior starts with a charismatic leader who increasingly becomes an object of worship as a general principle that may not have originally sustained the group in the beginning, that a living leader who is not meaningfully accountable and becomes a single most defined element in a group and a source of power and authority. What this is saying is this group might have started out as a religious group, believing, worshiping to a god in whatever form that was. But this charismatic leader comes in and it becomes more about worshiping, following the leader, the man, than it is the religion or the teachings. It becomes more about this person leading the group than what the group was based on. And again, we're going to see when we get into the Warren Jeffs era, this is very prevalent. It becomes less about let's worship God and follow our Mormon book and more about, are we following Warren Jeffs? All right, the second point is a process of indoctrination or education that is used that can be seen as comprehensive persuading through a reform, commonly called brainwashing. So, I feel like the Mormons are indoctrinated anyway, but in the Warren Jeffs era, this becomes more and more prevalent because of the choices he decides to make on A, their education, B, their contact with the outside world, and C, the information that he was sharing with them in general. And I know this sounds very vague at this point in time, guys, because I haven't gotten into like the crimes and stuff, and so I will bring this up again at the end of the next episode, but I want you guys to see these criterias and understand why I call it a cult when I call it a cult. There was a huge shift in the indoctrination and the brainwashing of his community. The next point is economical, sexual, and other exploitations of group members by the leader for ruling decisions. The destructiveness of a group called a cult varies by degree, from labor violations, child abuse, medical neglect, and some extreme isolation situations, calls for violence or mass suicide. So, I'm not just going to corner FLDS on this one because I know we all know other groups that are like this. Sexual exploitation, economic exploitation, the violence, the medical neglect, the child abuse, this happens in a lot of groups. Jonestown with mass suicide, Seven-Day Advents, the Brass Davidians from Waco, Texas, we see that in them, with them. The Children of God with the sexual exploitation, that group. It's prevalent in other groups. I'm not trying to single out the FLDS on this one because they're not the only problematic cult group. All right, the next point. Absolute authority without meaningful accountability. Again, I know this sounds very vague because I haven't given you guys any specifics, but Warren Jeffs does this absolutely with the FLDS. The do not question my authority. I am the mouthpiece of God. The next one is no tolerance of questions or critical thinking. This is another one we're going to get into about the don't question me. This also comes up with the excommunication of young men in the group and other high-ranking people who question his authority. No meaningful financial disclosure regarding budgets or expenses such as independent auditing or financial statements. This one is a huge one for me, guys, and I have a personal example of this. So, I make no queries that I am a Christian woman. I believe my religion wholeheartedly. I don't hate on anybody else who has outside other beliefs or religions. Everybody is free to choose. You believe how you want to. I believe how I want to. I'm not saying my church is perfect and awesome and should be held to a higher standard, because it's not. But I can tell you right now that I don't go to church for my pastor. I have a very awesome pastor. I have a very awesome church community. But I don't go for him. I go for God, and I go for my own peace of mind. But anyway, we went from a very small church. We were in an old dry cleaners, and then we moved to a storefront. And then from the storefront, an amazing opportunity happened, which started out as a tragedy. We had 2 colleges in my city, both closed down within a couple years of each other. The opportunity fell into my church community's lap to purchase one of the school properties, which was 10 acres and like 16 buildings. And we purchased it. I mean, we're making payments and stuff on it, but we took the initiative to purchase it. It was a large sum of money, a couple $1 million. And if anybody in my church, including myself, ever looked at that and was like, where did this money come from? Or the money I put in the basket on Sundays, if I ever wanted to question where it went to, I could go to my leaders and say, hey, I want to know where my money's going, and they would show me. There is financial transparency. That is a huge one. That is also a huge reason why I go to church there, because I've had my own religious battles with things that I was taught and believed in early on in my life. I say this to tell you that this didn't happen in the FLDS. If anybody went to Warren Jeffs or any of the other bishops and asked where their money was going, they would get shut down. There is no financial transparency there. I can also tell you that with our property, if I was like, hey, I want to know what we're going to do with that building, my pastor would gladly show me the plans and give me a 5-year plan on what we're going to do with that property, where the money's going to go, and how we're going to achieve that. Because it is financial transparency. It is transparency in general. I have never questioned my pastor and not gotten a legitimate answer that I didn't feel comfortable with. I say that to tell you because I know from what I've heard and what I've read that this group didn't do that. They were always shut down. You didn't question that because they were the mouthpiece of God. Anyway, I go on. The next point is unreasonable fears about the outside world, such as impending cataclysms, evil conspiracies. This is a huge one for the FLDS. The outside world is evil. The world is coming to an end. We have to prepare for the end times. The world's going to end at this date. I'm going to talk about it next week, so I'm really trying hard not to, knock off my key points, guys. But he prophesies that with the Olympics coming to Salt Lake City in the 2000s, that was going to be the end of the world, and God was going to end the world then, because all eyes would be on Salt Lake City and the evil. So a lot of this community moved from Salt Lake City back to Short Creek, the Short Creek community. It's just more manipulation, more fear. The world's going to end. We all have to commune together. It's just more driving that fear in. And I know with the Short Creek raid and stuff, that kind of solidifies it, because the government did come out and it did tear apart their families, and it did, it solidified that the outside world is against us. That's another abuse that happens in cults. And the last point, is former members often relate to the same stories of abuse and reflect similar patterns of grievances. I'm sorry, this isn't the last point. There's a couple more. But yeah, this is when you hear stories of people who have left the FLDS, they all sound similar. It's all abuse, it's all exploitation, and it's all manipulation of power. They're all the same grievance. They're all the same abuse. The next one is their records, books, newsletters, broadcast reports, and documents. There's document of abuse from the group leader. There is documented abuse, guys. Just plain and simple. The next point is followers feel never good enough. This is so huge with the community. He, especially when he breaks off and he leaves Short Creek and sets up other communities elsewhere, but more prevalent with the Texas, the El Dorado, Texas compound. He starts to talk about the people back in Short Creek being the half-hearted and not good enough. And he records a lot of his sermons and stuff like that. So the people of Short Creek are listening to his sermons and hearing him talk about them as the half-hearted and not good enough. And that's why I'm not taking you to Texas. And that's why I'm putting my energy into this other group, because you guys aren't good enough. Yeah, it's just plain and simple cult behavior. Talking down to your community so that they try better, they do more, they kiss your butt more so that they can get in. A group/leader is always right. I mean, this goes back to the no questioning. And then the last one, for all intents and purposes, there are other ones, but these are like the big main points. Group or leader has the executive meaning and knowing of the truth or receiving validation. No other process of discovery is accepted or credible. I'm sorry to say this again, guys, but we're going to get more into this next week. But this becomes a huge thing with Warren Jeffs. Anybody that questions him, anybody that does not see with his vision, as we'll say, is kicked out, because there is no questioning the almighty mouthpiece of God, is what he calls himself. So yeah. So that is the Rick Ross criteria for a cult. That is what I go off of. I mean, we'll talk about this when we talk about other groups, but for this, all intents and purposes of the FLDS, this is what I'm going by. So from here on out, when I call it a cult, you guys understand where I'm coming from, because this group ticks off all those criteria. Plain and simple. And I will give you the ins and outs next week when we talk about the Warren Jeffs era. I'm not saying... I'm trying to be nice here, but I'm also know what's coming. So again, I take you back to my previous, yes, it meets cult criteria, but it's because of the actions of this one man. Because like I said, the Leroy eras, everybody was happy. I rarely hear people talk about the Leroy Johnston era and them talking about the exploitations and stuff that they do in the Jeffs era. And that's not to say it was only on Warren, because Rulon had his downfalls too, and we will talk more about that next week, because his crimes lead into Warren's crimes. But yeah. I don't have much more to say without getting into the Warren Jeffs era, guys. So I think I'm going to end this here. I'm really sorry about the technical difficulty. I feel like this is a better setup because it's a better flow, but I had more commentary from Colleen, and I'm sorry she's not here to put this in perspective a little bit, but next week I will triple multi-check and make sure I have a good recording with both of us, because I really want her input in, especially on the Warren Jeffs stuff. But thank you guys for buckling up and listening. I hope you stuck with it. I know it was kind of a lot of history stuff thrown in your face, and it wasn't very true crimey culty, but we're getting there. I promise. I just had to lay some foundation so you guys had a better understanding, and that I didn't have a 3-hour episode in one sitting for you guys. So thank you for listening. thank you for sticking with us. I appreciate all of you from the bottom of my heart without getting emotional. This has been an endeavor that I truly am enjoying, and I'm enjoying seeing your guys' input, and I'm enjoying seeing our little community grow. And it's really so far been an awesome ride. I mean, I know we're only on episode 4, guys, but it's been an awesome ride so far, and I love each and every one of you little listeners. Thank you. And for future reference, I will still love all of you little listeners. If you're listening to this today, if you're listening to this 5 years down the road, thank you for your support. All right, guys, I have nothing else to tell you in this episode except be safe, be loving, be good humans, and Cece is out.